the Galileo Ventures podcast, US election special, discussing what 4 more years of Trump might mean for the tech sector, both in the US and Australia. I'm James, joined by my co-host Hugh, and today we have a special guest, our amazing Galileo coach and an American Aussie tech veteran, Julia French. Welcome, Julia.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for joining. Quick bio on you. Hopefully I get this right. Julia, you've spent 15 years working across Silicon Valley and Australia in many startups that we've all heard about, including Atlassian, Dropbox, and WhatsApp. I believe in the early days of WhatsApp. Is that correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
WhatsApp only ever went to 25 people, so I think it was probably all early days, really. But yes.
Sure. But one of the most storied acquisitions, which may now get banned in Australia if the social media ban goes through, which we will talk about. But we won't talk about it right now. We did the US election first. And you actively work now helping bridge tech markets from Australia, London, Germany, Silicon Valley as well. And so thank you very much for coming on the pod. Look, let's just dive straight into it. So I wanted to start with the Economist quote. The most consequential American president since Franklin D. Roosevelt. Not exactly mincing their words here, but if we look at the win, I mean, it is a sea of red, right? Maybe we'll put up the little election thing as well. What's your take on this? You're an American living abroad. I would love to have your take on why he won to such a big degree and your view on that.
So I think it's a lot of different factors. I don't think it's just one. And full caveat, I'm a West Coaster, right? So for us, we're this, the strip of blue that was along the big sea of red, right?
Yep.
But I think predominantly it was kind of 3 different things that unfolded. So post-COVID, the management of COVID during his last presidency, the management of just kind of generally everything. Then you had January 6th occur. I think the whole country was just like, we've got to just close out the drama and close out what's happening, and we will take anyone. And I think that's how we ended up with the Joe Biden-Harris ticket. And the idea was that the Democratic Party would find something else in that time period to put forward. So she was never supposed to run as a presidential candidate. I think women back home really want to have a female president. I think that it is extremely meaningful for America and will eventually occur. I think it will eventuate for sure. I think the second part is Americans are tired. They have bared the brunt of, everybody might have a different opinion, but American perspective is they work the most, they vacation the least. They have brought to fruition the majority of the different technologies that we are currently using in our world. They are the invention hub, if you will. And that has come at a price that Americans have had to pay while everybody else has kind of been enjoying their beach life. It has been a time period of constantly bailing out other countries, helping other countries, trying to manage a border crisis, trying to manage immigration. We've had probably the biggest human migrations occur since probably Syrian refugees started. I mean, in all of the different wars in the Middle East, right? Yep. And we're constantly left to kind of support this police the world kind of position. I think at the end of the day, Americans are tired, right? It's not the days of coming in and being like, okay, follow our lead, follow our example. We've proven ourselves and we've proven everything. I think it's now kind of up to other countries to really start building out their own domestic infrastructures to a degree where they aren't carried by America, where they're not carried by our industries, where they're not carried by their trade agreements with America, right? Yeah. I think if anything, those are kind of the 2 big things I think that occurred. The third thing was his choice as VP candidate. So by choosing Jack Vance, the
first VC in office, I believe, right? The first proper venture capitalist to be...
He'd like to think he is, right? Coming in as Thiel's LP, right? But he did a lot of work prior to, right? So from his book to the TV show, to the Showtime show, to everything, he is an entity of himself, right? And so I think a lot of people were looking at, okay, this isn't a Mike Pence Trump situation. We're really getting JD Vance in real reality. And they felt maybe more confident that JD Vance can hold that, if that makes sense. They're feeling like, okay, he can hang on to things a bit better. So, and he has his own following. And then on top of that, there was massive activation of all of the young 20-something unemployed males. And it was
Yeah.
kind of the last stand of the white man, if you will, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was really interesting to hear Elon tweet and talk about profusely how on X, all the memes were for Trump, all of the stuff he was seeing for Trump. And that was true. And I just thought maybe that's just an aberration. That's the last vanguard of Twitter users. But actually, no, it turned out to be a lot of these disenfranchised slash, people that have switched across from Democrats. So we're like kind of like making a lot of fun and really signing up to the Elon thesis of like, where the future's heading, which has been interesting to kind of see him talk about.
Yeah, I think it's also they feel like with Trump comes in a lot of deregulation, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Yep.
I've been saying it for the past 6 months. A Trump presidency at the dawn of AI, at the height of AI's movement, the two paralleled together will be super, super significant. You have NASDAQ where the listing requirements have become so burdensome and so onerous that your IPO market is probably pretty fairly nascent at the moment. And then on top of that, you're also dealing with private equity running around becoming maybe the de facto listing, which the problem with private equity money is it doesn't go back into those local economies. It kind of swirls in this like bucket of cash, right? That's in a completely separate asset class that people don't quite understand. Anyway, so I think it's all of those things kind of unfolded. I think the pitch for having a new exchange down in Texas is a huge point as well. Trump will have no problem. He'll be like, yeah, go, right? Versus if you had a much more policy forward, I guess, group, that would create a lot of rub, right? So I think you have a lot of people in San Francisco that want San Francisco back. They want another market. So I think that's where that kind of unfolded, if you will. Like, I think it's those areas.
Just picking up on something that you said there, like, what do you think? I think an interesting question here is, as we enter the age of AI, as you mentioned, what do you think certainly in my head, I find it hard to think about what exactly Trump's, I'll say policy stance, right? And whether or not you really want to say Trump really has policy stance, but I guess opinion might be a better perspective. But what do you sort of think that sort of perspective is going to be of the Trump government, let's call it, of this world of AI?
Yeah. So I think it's going to be interesting because it's going to be the point of conflict will come with your hard right and the tool sets that they don't like their children using, they don't want to use. They tend to be very anti-technology. And then more libertarian kind of coming in from the top. And then on the other side are going to be the business implications, right? Because if he's like, oh, there's something else America can win and we can take, market dominance, he'll be all for it, right? So I think the policies they won't be protectionary, they'll be business focused, there'll be things like what he did before, the big tax cuts, they'll include like different types of, it'll be all around the exit capital, in fact, setting up that thing down in Texas and then finding ways to make it so that exits aren't as regulated, right? So our secondary share sales used to be fairly unregulated, which is why we ended up with a lot of this tech. If you were at a tech company, let's say for 2 years, majority of the people that started early, you held those shares, you could sell those shares back. And then as a result, that kind of created this massive influx of capital, increased valuations, a comfort level with venture capital that hadn't been there previously. So it was no longer considered to be such a dangerous asset class, right? It kind of fell more into this like lower, not high risk anymore. It was like medium, maybe a bit low risk, right? Because you started to see an actual kind of chain, right? And I think we're seeing that starting in Australia, but there's the early stage to your secondary sale onward to either a major exit or an acquisition. I think you'll see a lot more acquisitions. He's going to push for that. More M&A.
Yeah, you've got to imagine the period of the sort of Lena Khan FTC is certainly going to be not necessarily over, but certainly substantially reduced.
Substantially reduced. They've now gotten control of the Senate. So a lot of that stuff, I think you're just going to see it open up. It's Wild West. I mean, I did text my brother the night before going, if Trump wins, I'm moving back to SF. It's going to be the Wild West. I can't wait to get in. So, you know, in my
Couldn't you be
moment,
moving to Florida and, you know, crypto?
no,
Right?
nobody goes to Florida. Hard no.
Crypto people, you know, like,
No. I think
it's
even
Web
even
3.1.
no, even my American friends that went to Florida, like, let's put it this way, one of the first original Atlassian acquisitions, this guy named Justin Sepka, he went to Florida and he was like, yeah, okay, I'm out. And he went back. So he is sitting in Calistoga bottling his own wine. So, you know, his life is good. But
That sounds great.
Having
Yeah.
a terrible time.
definitely
Yeah.
having a
So
terrible
I
time.
think, I mean, look, I wanted to unpick that point, right? Because I think it's one of the most interesting things for me, which is the Democrats in the US swinging away from technology, right? Technology becoming the villain for them. I'm sort of generalizing here. But
Yeah.
one of the most interesting things is, you know, one, under Democrats, we would have crypto regulation, which is the main reason why Andreessen Partners came out publicly, I think. Two, it was like, obviously very pro-tech innovation and deregulation, or mostly deregulation, which then meant more tech innovation, right? Which made the Trump supporters. And one of the interesting things for me is watching so many of these previous Democrat tech people lose their Democratic kind of votes and switch across to Republican as a result of the sort of the more pro-technology policies of Trump. Did you see that among your friends out of interest? Did you see some of that switch happen?
Yeah.
Where people were kind of like going, you know what, like Democrats are losing a bit of their way when it comes to these
So I
regulations?
had different VC friends that went different ways. And
Okay.
I had different friends that are founders that went different ways. You have to remember that libertarian contingent in San Francisco is huge, right? San
Yeah.
Francisco is really unique. And
Which is the Peter
libertarian,
Thiel kind of like way of work thinking, right? A little bit.
I would put him as an extreme, like far extreme.
Sure.
I think there's a lot of people that kind of feel like left to our own devices within San Francisco, we kind of created this kind of place that was like the city of the future, right? Like in our mind, right? And I think from that, there's the idea that things will flux and carry their own, right? And resolve themselves. I think the Democratic pushback was on the fact that it just became kind of this cancel culture. And then, that became a pushback on people who had really put a lot of time, energy, and effort into creating, products that we all use today, where they do carry a lot of social responsibility, right? So Mark Benioff, for example, he goes down to Burlingame High School, the high school he went to. He's always providing, he's got more social programs running than anybody I know. Yeah, he's also kind of come out as very pro-business. Martin Miko's the founder of MySQL. He came out supporting, the Democratic Party, but he also was kind of we've all got to work out how to get along. You know what I mean? We all have to be able to hold different viewpoints, right? So I think in America, there's a bunch of different things happening all at once. There's people who are kind of tired of the tech bros in San Francisco and the large amounts of wealth that they feel haven't been, proportionately allocated across to everyone, right? And so they start to look like everything they epitomize, right? In lots of ways, they start to look special and everything that they were fighting against in the first place, right? So, but as with all things, they all go circular, right?
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was interesting that I would have recent interview with Mark Andreessen, who's kind of out there in force, doing lots of interviews now. One of the things he keeps sort of mentioning is how, a decade ago, a lot of people in tech were kind of overlooked by politics because people didn't think some of this stuff would be very consequential. I mean, even 2 decades ago, that was the case. And now all of a sudden, this technology is very consequential, right? Chips, AI, it's the driving force of American competitivism, right? And so I think all of a sudden, I think the analogy he used was it's a bit like the dogs chasing after the bus, but spit the bus, and now now it doesn't know what to do. And so you've got all these,
Totally.
you've got all these tech people who are so powerful, and they're it's what are they doing now?
Well, we've always been. I think I think there's things that we underestimated about the products that we built. For sure. You always believe that you're going to provide tools to humanity and they're going to use them for the greater good, right?
Sure. Naive, optimistic view.
Oh,
Yeah.
we're gonna come back. We're gonna come back to that one though.
Yeah. But I think that's where it started, right? It was the idea that, these things, YouTube, I still remember when Chad Hurley like pitched, it was Ezra Roizen, me, we were doing the Always On conference. There were 4 different video players at the time. So there was Gooba, which had originally done porn. There was YouTube, so Chad, and then there was Bright Cove, right? And it was like, the idea was we were
Remember
going
Bright Cove?
right, but we were going to create this beautiful world where people could access education, they could access materials, we could share things, we would know how to fix things, and we wouldn't have to just read from books anymore and go to the library. We were going to democratize, the culture. We were going to democratize society. We were going to make things that accessible for people who couldn't, there's a lot of people who can't access everything all the time, right? And so that was the idea, right? Everything starts there. I think what we didn't anticipate is that the majority of the business model that underpins a lot of the technologies that we use are ad networks. People ask me why I always, in my career, I've gone from, a social media back into back into an ad network, back out again, back out again. And the reason is that I find advertising fascinating, right? I think Marshall McLuhan, his interview in Sydney, Australia, I've played over and over my entire life. Like, it's from the 70s and it's just amazing. And he talks about the TV and how the TV will enter our homes. Anyway, so I digress, but
We'll have to link that into the show notes.
Yeah, I think like at the end of the day, like that's really what's happening is this conflict of what we want to be. Look at AI, it's starting out as open source, right? It's starting out as like a tool of the people.
Yeah.
And
now, just jumping on that, I just want to ask you something on that, because we're seeing the battle start to play out in Australia. Fun fact: Australia is one of the most scared countries of AI. If you believe some of the surveys people have done,
I can definitely believe that. You look at our power of our trade unions and things, and you can see why they're afraid of AI.
Exactly, right. But there's also
we also have the largest amount of AI developers on a single platform out of any country currently, right?
Correct.
So my former student Annie Lau started Build AI, like the Build Club, and you can just kind of see everything that she's kind of put together. You've got all of these developers sitting on one platform. Nobody else has that. Australia is the first. Does not exist in the States, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I wonder, are we really afraid?
I think we are, though, because I think the other piece is that we're afraid of what might happen. Like, I think one of the things that maybe is different compared to the States is that if you're a serious, sort of PhD level AI scientist, let's call it, deep science version of AI, in the US, like, you'll end up just getting an amazing salary at, Google, Facebook, Apple, something like that. You'll just get gobbled up by them. But locally, we don't really have those big native, what are you going to do? Work for realestate.com.au and AI predictions. Like, there's not that degree of interest. Whereas if you go and work for Google in the US, you've got fascinating problems they can solve. And I think in Australia, we don't have domestic companies that size, that is, that are solving those kind of fascinating problems. Because who wants to go and work for Atlassian to put AI into Jira? Like...
Well, but it's changing, right? We've got a nascent AI industry, and this is the thing that worries me a little bit, right? Because
I do see there are companies, there are smart first movers that are going fast.
The builders are here. The builders are here.
Like, AI, for example, I know of an architecture firm, they're figuring out how to use AI for all of their reporting that they have to do. And they're building proprietary technology inside their businesses. So it's much more workflow tool oriented, if you will. So your point to Jira.
Application layer stuff.
Yeah, application layer. So your point to Jira, I mean, that's what Build Club is. It's a platform similar to Jira, right? Where you pick and pull and add things into your bug tracker, be it a Gantt chart or this or that or the other thing. So we are good at that. Like, I do think Australia is really great at figuring out, okay, I have this one unique use case. How do I do that? And I think Annie's done that at mass, right? So to your point about the PhD developer, I think they are finding a home. They aren't going into the major large companies, but I don't know where our major large companies will be, right?
Yeah, but I think that's what makes it interesting, right? Is that I think they're gonna be created, right? Like, it's not like I think that they already exist.
No, I think the biggest thing is that we will see a push for something that is much needed in Australia, which we have in the US, which is an entity which lives inside large multinational corporations, which is called the head of corporate development. So this person heads up corporate development. They try to figure out how do they develop the corporation from a technology perspective, people perspective, and they go out and they headhunt those that are really good at what they do. Small teams, small acquisitions, 5 mil, 8 mil, 10 mil. And once we have that in Australia, that and an active secondary market and a good exit strategy, we will have a robust tech ecosystem.
Yeah,
But
I agree. I think one of the biggest failings, in a sense, I'll say failings, but one of the biggest weaknesses of the Australian tech market is that piece of where we don't have those kind of, we'll call them mid-market, but they're not probably not necessarily mid-market in the US sense, but mid-market exits. You know, like we've got things at the big end, but we don't really have those opportunities, and we certainly don't have the sort of acquisition approach of our local companies, of our local larger companies, than you see of the US tech companies.
But I think AI will be this forcing function because I don't see that corporates, the current corporates that we have, it also creates a regulation and policy issue, right? So let's take CBRE, let's take Deloitte, KPMG. They also operate outside the US, right? So if Deloitte unrolls, whatever AI tech to work within their workflow, they're going to have to also adopt that here, right? And with the policy structure as it stands now, I'm not sure how Australia is going to move forward there. With this, if you now have Trump in office, you're going to have a high influx of AI.
So AI deregulation is probably going to come under Trump. Do you think that will positively impact the conversations in Australia? Because it feels like Australia is heading really into the territory of the EU, where it's like, let's stop, curtail any development, let's stop access, let's regulate AI. Whereas with Trump coming in, do you think, given Australia often follows American policy in some ways, do you think that might happen, or what's your kind of view on that?
I think at the moment, Australia, the thing that's really interesting about the election and the result of the election is Australia will have to now really start to look to itself. So less of like, okay, we'll just import this. Right now, we saw the pain points that we saw during COVID. No pharmaceutical industry, no ability to produce, like we could not produce onshore a vaccine, right? We're still in this process of like trying to understand what we want to be while still clinging to very Australian values. So how do we keep those Australian values, those things that really matter to the culture and matter to everybody here, right? How do you keep that?
So you're saying we should put mining on the block mining on the AI, right? How do we dig steel out of AI?
I think we have to find ways that where Australia starts to move without relying on trade, right? Without relying on import or export, and Australia starts to build out its population base more. Australia starts to move forward in a way where it can kind of stand on its own within Asia Pac. You're looking at big conflicts that are kind of coming down the pipe, and Trump will force those more. So you have Taiwan coming. I live in a beautiful place, but I also see the Taiwanese military coming in, with the Australian military doing a lot of meetings. And, so we need to prepare that Australia has to figure out how to go forward kind of more alone than maybe it has previously. So we had talked briefly about the sub and the building of the sub and these different things that we've taken on in hopes that that's going to increase our GDP and whatnot. And I think we're going to find that we have to just be okay without somebody buying something that we create, and that it has to be for us. Like it has to be for Australia, right?
Speaking of AUKUS, right? These subs, I'm not a fan of us spending this amount of money to buy a few subs, but not at all. And I've blogged about, what if we spent that money on AI? Like, how much would that change our sovereign capability? Imagine if we invested that much in AI, nearly 300 billion, right? Would be the third biggest. But I don't want to talk about that. I wanted to ask you, because now that Trump's back in power, the number one thing my politician friends are asking, and my friends who work in the offices are saying, is AUKUS going to continue? It's ultimately up to the president to decide, and I'm wondering whether they're actually going to give us 5 subs, given that the Navy in the US is behind schedule.
I think that America is going to do less of taking care of other people. As I said in the beginning, like America's tired. They're tired. They're worn out. He will definitely be protectionary, like towards the U.S., but he's not going to go and offer up, here's billions of dollars in aid. Here's another, I don't know, let's go. It'll be similar to like what's kind of happened, in the Middle East. Like, sure, we'll send a boat. Like, other than that, nobody, even with the humanitarian situation on both sides, like I have friends on both sides. I'm not going to comment on that, but I think it's just, America's not going to not do anything, but they're not going to do something. Does that make sense?
Yeah. See, I think that AUKUS is relatively safe. Like, I think perhaps ironically, I think AUKUS is comparatively safe because I think for the US and for Trump, like China is the devil, right? And there is such a strong capacity to improve the military relationship with Australia, knowing how much of our sort of northern borders, are the western border to China, if that makes sense.
So I would say your average American doesn't even know about this deal. Like if I picked up the phone right now and called my brother and like 5 of his golfing buddies, they wouldn't even know about it. Right. So not to say that they're not, wise dudes or anything, but you get my point. Like,
but I guess on a foreign policy level, it does align with Trump's stance on foreign policy. I agree. It's sort of like it may go counter to his sense of like sovereign capability and obviously keeping that stuff within the US. But I think there's more of it's quite different. I think in some ways, if it was still a French deal, it would potentially be more messy because the French it was always just a commercial relationship. Whereas AUKUS is much more strategic.
I think what you're hooking into is the thing that I'm saying, which is like, I think Australia has to move on its own, like it's going to make its own. So I think at the end of the day, it's kind of it's going to turn into much more Australia first. Australia has to think, okay, great. How do we build a pharma industry? How are we taking all this amazing, we have some of the most amazing universities, right? I've taught in there, and at the end of the day, we can't seem to get a single product out.
Yeah, exactly. particularly a large complex.
It's a whole other topic, but I think these are all forcing functions of the election, and I do think they will have an impact, right?
Yeah, and I agree with that, and I think like when it comes to AUKUS, for example, it's definitely, I think it's an interesting piece in that. Had Australia thought about this separately, again, knowing how big, we're an island in the middle of nowhere, it's almost an astonishing fact that we don't have sovereign capability to produce nuclear submarines given our country, and that in itself is actually in some ways a surprise. And, I think this was kind of the piece of, well, it's a bit late now to sort of start that from a blank piece of paper. And so what do we do? And we've sort of ended up maybe...
all the things that you're kind of talking about. I mean, the money investment, what James just said, right? He's like, this is a huge chunk of money. You could do something else. And I do feel like we need an educational restructuring. I think that is absolutely key. Like, I think that we need to be teaching skills much, much, much earlier. I am a huge, huge proponent. Like if somebody woke up tomorrow and said, we have a transition plan to move away from the ATAR, I would be the first person on the door to help support in any way possible. I think what it's doing to our culture, I think what it's doing to Australia overall is just beyond unhealthy, and it's going to leave us holding the bag, like in a bad way, especially with this election coming. Like we do not have an educational structure that is prepared and ready for AI.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot that we need to do within that space, and it just concerns me that there's been almost very little action in Australia when it comes to AI policy. Unlike in the US where you've had the CHIPS Act, which is probably one of the best things Biden did. I don't know if you agree.
I don't think there is a single Republican or Democrat that would say that wasn't amazing.
Right? Yeah, right. We don't have a single. But what's the CHIP Act in Australia? We don't have a single one. So a bit of backstory. I spoke to, I can't name who, staffer for a politician on this, right? And they were like, they were surprised Australia is so behind the eight ball on like whether we should be manufacturing chips, getting TSMC, the Taiwan firm, to manufacture chips here. We're so behind the eight ball. They're like, even Singapore is ahead of us on this. And it's like, it's incredible that Australia hasn't even had that conversation. Here we are, and we still haven't had the conversation. It's just amazing. I wanted to ask you quickly, where else do you think, if you think about Australia and the USA post this election, what other aspects do you think are top of mind where we may lose or we may benefit from the outcome of another Trump presidency?
I think, well, the drama factor with Trump is high, right? So
He's a bit of a drama queen.
buckle up, right? I think the drama factor is high. I don't personally believe and perceive that JD Vance will be able to rein him in whatsoever. I don't think he'll be able to move him, maneuver him, or partner with him. I think eventually that relationship will be a struggle. And I hope it unfolds in a good way, right? I hope it doesn't fall apart in a way that is detrimental. In terms of other things, so visas, I think right now the E3 was protected last time. I don't know if it would be moving forward. So that will create issues, because right now, one of the greatest things about being able to go over to the US is you can go over there, you can go on kind of a learning journey, I call it. Like, you just go, you like meet with as many people as possible, get as many new ideas as possible. This is knowledge transfer, right?
Yeah.
And we know that knowledge transfer is like really important. And we know that you can't, everything that you get from a conversation, podcast, book, or otherwise is a bit manufactured, right? And you aren't really able to have enough en masse so that you can build your own opinion. So I worry about that. I don't know how Trump will come down on that. I worry about things like structure.
And sorry, just to unpack the E3, is that because of his really strong anti-immigration policy, or kind of
100%.
Yeah, sure.
And he went, I mean, he chopped Canada. I'm like, he went for everybody last time.
True.
He didn't just say like he was a H-1B, you're out. Like,
true. I mean, the E3 was guaranteed to us as a result of John Howard backing Afghanistan, right? And so I wonder whether that will hold sweet or not with the Trump presidency.
I mean, you can't imagine that Trump is going to care about old deals.
Yeah, exactly.
So hence my concern. We have a lot of students that study abroad. We have a lot of students that play sports abroad, that go to American schools, that play sports abroad, that will be impactful to the F1 as well. Like, how many Australian F1 holders, like, people think that visas don't matter, but when you live on an island like we do, it does matter, right? And being able to have access to those. And the E3 is such a beautiful visa. It's easy. It doesn't have a cap. It's amazing. You can take your spouse, you can take your family. I mean, it's what enabled our entire 2007 kind of Aussie mafia to exist, right? Like, Jeff McQueen wrote a whole, blog post about E3. It was all about, like, how do you do it? How can you make it happen? Anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I think that'll be the biggest one. I think the other thing will be how Australia wants to engage. I think companies will move very fast in the US, and I don't know how that will impact the majority of our consulting firms. So Accenture, et cetera, like, will that be job reduction that ends up occurring in Australia? All the way down into the other, like, legal, right, compliance, right? Once you start having majority of the products that we use are US products, right? They are not Australia products. And we have not built any of our own. So
exactly. I mean, I think one of the most amazing things to me is just watching the debate around social media and how it is completely one-sided. It is Australia shouting at companies they have no control over, that don't care about us, and this like e-safety commissioner coming up with the most bizarre policies. It's almost it's like the classic boomer worrying about their kids. And so I guess switching gear a little bit, just to bring things to a final topic here, social media, right? This election was social media was a big thing, as it always. Elon being the owner of X, as we mentioned before, and now in Australia, just announced on the day of the results that we're banning social media. What's your
For under
world
18s.
leading
For
ban?
under 18s.
Yeah.
You forgot that part.
For under
James.
16s.
Sorry,
For under 16s.
16. Did he go under
Banning
16
social
or did he
media-
go under 18? What did we go?
Under
what did he go
16.
with?
It was 16.
Under
16.
16. 16, under 16. Total ban. Like, it's, as far as we can tell, details are thin, but it's going to be a total ban, and it's up to the other companies, aka Snapchat, Instagram, to enforce it. What is your view? And what's your view on that?
Oh, this is so tough, right? So I'll start off by saying I have a 24, 25-year-old. They are in that generation bucket. They wrote the book for the anxious generation. The Atlantic Monthly, when my son was in high school, he had 3 suicides in 1 year. It was on the cover. It was called the Silicon Valley Suicides. They all happened at high school, right? It was this kind of idea that the dawn of social media, the dawn of all of this kind of created this anxious generation. What are my thoughts? My thoughts are, at the end of the day, it's a lack of education, right? So if you talk to the majority of tech folk, they don't have a highly tech lifestyle. I don't know how to explain that. I mean, most of it, I'd say majority of the kids are, maybe there's one iPad in the house at most, right? But the idea is that you teach your children how technology works, how it functions. And this goes back to my education point, right? If you ask a 7-year-old, what is Wi-Fi, how does it work, and what does it enable you to do, they cannot answer the question. So in America, those classes and those courses start earlier. I'm not saying they happen in every school. I'm not saying they happen in every state. I'm saying that there is a baseline education that we have to enable everybody to access around technology, around social media, around AI, right? So for example, my son, he has a Rabbit AI device, right? So he can take pictures, it reads to him, it tells him all about different things. And the reasoning for us allowing him access to that is that he now has a tool to gather information. So we will say, okay, well, why don't you search up the same thing on the iPad? Do you get the same answer? Do you have the same answer? Why or why not do you have the same answer? Why do you trust Rabbit more than, say, looking online and taking a look, right? So it's these kinds of things.
First time I've heard of Rabbit being used, by the way.
Really? It's like, so it's a little orange. It's a little, I know, great name, right?
I know what it is. I
Like,
I just didn't know anyone was actually using it,
Yeah. People actually use it. And I mean, if I could switch iPads out for the Rabbit for every school, I would. So I think it provides much better. Anyway, I could go on down the list. I'm a huge fan. So, and I think there's a lot on offer there. Anyway, back to your social media. I think it's just lack of education at the end of the day. Like, sure, you can do a blanket protectionary policy, but that's not going to help your child with discernment. It's not going to help your child to say, okay, I'm opting out. You're basically saying, we cannot trust you to make your own decisions, so we're going to just carte blanche, cut it out, right? Yeah. And Australia tends to make that move, right? In other areas as well. And I think instead of moving towards what we know works, which is education, and we know that if you educate and if you provide education, then we know that ends up being the cornerstone to your being able to make decisions, right? Yep. Like when they ran DARE, everybody makes fun of me, but I always talk about this. So Nancy Reagan's DARE program, I grew up on this in school, right? It was all education about drugs because there was a war on drugs and everything. I have to say, though, we are the most educated about drugs. Like, we know what they are, we could, and I think from that created a culture where, like, we ended up we weren't the high-end pharmaceutical eaters and we weren't the cocaine users, like, you know what I mean? So as a result of that education process, you ended up with the answer, which is people to create discernment. So I think you're going to have 100%. The same problem with AI. You can't ban it all. Yeah. Right? Like,
well, this is what I was saying. Like, what are we going to do? We're gonna like AI talking to kids. We're going to ban that now because it's social. Like,
well, I think it's also the classic question of like, what exactly is social media? And you saw that example of YouTube with, I can't remember who it was, the politician getting asked like, is YouTube included? And there's like this 6,000 word response being like, and it's like, well,
it is. And then I was going to ask, what about WhatsApp? I mean, WhatsApp's a great social network, right? Should we ban
Meta.
WhatsApp for kids under 16, right? Because we're banning Instagram, I mean, it's ludicrous. But I also wanted to pick out Hugh. You have a history in this. Tell us about your history and your experience with banning social media policy.
Yeah, so a long time ago, a very long time ago when I was young, in sort of my late teens, my early 20s, I was in, I guess, youth policy and things like that. This was one of the things that was floated. Like, this isn't a new idea, the whole thing of banning access to social and banning access to XYZ to sort of protect the children kind of thing. And we actually, I'd count myself in it, but, obviously it was a much bigger piece than just me, but, like, successfully managed to kill it. And a big reason why, and I think there's such an interesting, one of my favorite academics in this space actually is a woman called Dana Boyd, who Julia may know of,
Yes.
but who's a Microsoft researcher, but who has this fantastic book and story, and she's of a little bit of an older generation than me, but has this great story of how she grew up in the southern states of the US as a young lesbian, and the way that she was able to reconcile that, right, and reconcile her challenges with sexuality and who she was and everything else was Usenet forums, right? This was the, like, old dial-up days of, like,
Back
Usenet
in the
forums.
day.
And
Yep.
the anonymity associated with that allowed and enabled her to be able to explore those things while she was a child. She was under 16 here. And so I think, like, we often forget, we hear all the stories and we hear all of these stories. And I once actually gave a speech at a conference immediately after a mother who tragically had her child murdered by someone that her child had met online.
Yeah.
Horrible story, right?
Yeah.
Totally horrible story. And, like, the whole piece of you could see all the red flags, but no one noticed them along the way, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Horrible story. And then I had to get up and be like, so this is why social media is good for children. Possibly one of the hardest speaking gigs I've ever done in my life. But, like, I think we often forget those pieces of the way in which these platforms can, like, change the way that you relate to each other. It can enable different friendship groups. It enables the development of personality in different ways, I think, than perhaps people think about in the past. While also, yes, having these challenges of, does it generate this ADHD generation, this sort of lack of capacity to focus and everything else. And I don't know, James, you I'm sure would also remember the days of when we were in school and it was like, oh, did you use Wikipedia as a source for that? You should get on the Encyclopedia Britannica.
We had
like,
that. Yeah.
Loading your 16 CDs into your thing to get onto Encyclopedia Britannica.
But speaking of education, I was one of the first cohorts in Australia to get laptops for every single kid. We were 12 to 13 years old, year 6 going to year 7. And we had this debate early. And so we decided that Wikipedia was absolutely a great source because everyone had access to the internet on your own personal laptops. It was absolutely crazy. We were actually so far ahead. We had tours of principals from other schools around the world, Japan, US, come to our school to look at our setup because there was no education tool, there's no LMS. We just had Microsoft Office, direct access, a shared drive, and all that type of stuff. And every room had a projector, so we could, like, get on there and have the intranet and, like, get the files. And so we would, like, write on, and we had Microsoft tablets. This was before iPads. Like, we had all the tablets. Teachers could write on tablets. This was great. And we had all these debates. It was really funny because we kept having these debates in school and then going, yeah, we should do this. And then, like, 3 years later, everyone else would have that debate. And we're like, oh, we've already sorted this out. And, like, Wikipedia was one great one. It was very quickly, it was like, yeah, of course, we'll just use Wikipedia. It's fine.
Yeah, but schools are an interesting example though, because it's like if we come back to the sort of the social media ban, right? Schools have highly locked down Wi-Fi networks, right? And every kid has a laptop, right? Yeah. And so what you saw when you talk to a lot of the teachers, and a lot of my friends are sort of high school teachers and things, and what you see instead is like kids build social networks in like Google Sheets, and like all this other thing, like they work their way around these things. You can't assume that they're stupid. And all that's going to happen is that it's going to happen anyway.
Yeah, 100%. Exactly. And then the other kind of nuance to it is like the VPN aspect of it. I'm like, you can just VPN around the whole thing, right? It's like the idea that they don't know that. They totally know that. right? So then it just becomes, and then it becomes a whole kind of who takes the fine? Is it the parent? Is it the kid? Like, I don't know. I think at the end of the day, it has, but it goes back to what you're talking about. These technology tools that we are going to have access to, right? That we already have access to, similar to what I was talking about with YouTube, similar to what you're talking about with this experience with Dana Boyd, who I know, who's amazing. Like, that is really where, but that what you're holding there is reality, right? We're going to have access to tools and products that are both going to be harmful and good. Just like, I mean, think about the creation of the first knife, right? You can kill someone or you can eat. Like, so these are just the state of, this is just the ethical dilemma of humans, which is why I'm a huge proponent of putting in ethics courses, especially with Trump now in office and the rise of AI. I'm a huge fan of putting ethics courses into schools, into middle school, into high school. In America, you have junior year of high school, you have to take ethics. It's required. You don't graduate without it, right? And that has your trolley problem in it and all of these other things, right? Like you learn about these dilemmas that we have as we're navigating our different choices and what we want to do and what we don't want to do. So you need ethics, high technology, education, but you got to build that, right?
Yeah, and I think the thing that I always used to talk about was like, the other part is like, no amount of control that you implement, whether it's internet filtering, banning, social, whatever, none of that actually replaces the capacity or the importance of a parent to build trust with their child, that when the child is challenged, unsure, whatever, they feel they can talk to the parent. And we know from a million years of research,
100%.
a million years of research that like having a banning approach means that kids can't feel like they can't talk to their parents about challenges they have, whether it's about alcohol, relationships,
Everything.
like, you know, pick your poison. And, you know, is this then going to be the next iteration of all of that? And I think that certainly having that relationship is the most important part.
Exactly.
But you also and then what your parents also, they're also just sitting on their couches, they're on their devices. Like there's a whole kind of like, it's interesting because having parented in like 1999, right, basically, and then now again, right, with Amadeus and with Lorelai at 8 and 5, I have this there's like this pre-technology parenting, post-technology parenting, right? And in the handheld device, the phone, you go to like swim practice. Moms used to talk to each other. Now they're just like this, right? Trying to like do whatever, order groceries or whatever they're doing, right? Yeah. And which is fine, but I think it's also just everybody's behavior, right? At the end of the
and it's fascinating. You know, I've got a 7-month-old nephew, and one of his favorite things is to play with mum and dad's phone. And the reason why, like, he can't use it. It's not like he's got like Peppa Pig on it or whatever. It's like, but it's clearly because he sees mum and dad always holding and looking at their phones,
100%.
and wants to take it because it's clearly important to mum and dad.
I feel like a lot of the social media bad is like a self-reflection on like the parents going, yeah, I spend way too much time on my phone. Maybe I should be the one bad for my phone.
I mean, the irony, of course, is you look at all the scams and everything else, and they're all in like the 65+ year who think that, you know, Koshi is telling them to invest in
I think we could have done better though. So things that I think we could have done better is I think we could have explained the internet better. I think we could have explained, you know, when you're sitting, I know when I scroll what is happening on the back end. I know how cookies work. I know how the internet works, right? I ran the first apps that sat on the Facebook platform, right? When it ran its open platform, I monetized those. I went running around finding every developer to like set them up and hook them up and put them out there and put them up on the app network. I know exactly how that thing works. I know we basically like helped to build the social graph, right? Like, so I just feel like we haven't done a good job explaining the products that people use on a daily basis, right?
100%.
And I think that's the failing, right?
That's right. Because and that was similar when we were in school. We got the laptops, right? And I remember we had some just a tiny bit of education on like how you should use your laptop, how you should think about the internet. Don't look up porn, you know, be careful of forums. We actually got a little bit of that. And that was like, I took it for granted. But now I think about it and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of schools that don't teach kids anything to do with this stuff.
Nothing. My
And-
son has access to the iPad at school, and somebody figured out how to get onto YouTube. So they're supposed to be on an app called Epic, but they're not. They're on YouTube looking at whatever.
Well, this is my
just-
favorite thing, right? Is
mayhem.
we were in class and we worked out how to play games and
Yeah, of course.
tab all the time,
100%.
and the teachers, the failing was for us was actually the teachers didn't have any education, and it was the biggest insight for me was a change management thing, was how to like actually upskill teachers to like be in this environment, which was more of a thing back then. But one of the things I loved about it is no matter what the IT department did in the school to like block apps and websites, as
Always
a fun game. Yeah, exactly. We just found a way around it.
Yeah.
And it was really fun. At one point, there was like an entire share drive full of ripped movies and DVDs that the school got really, really annoyed by on their official like school drive that one day they found. And we were like, oh, damn it, they found it.
I think that's our failing. Right, our failing is the lack of education, and you see it now with AI. Right, it's also the same thing. People are like, "Well, what is it? How does it work?" A lot of people don't really understand. They're like, "Oh, ChatGPT, it'll write me an answer." Right. So I don't know if they.
So
I think we have to
it's
do a
funny
better
you say
job.
that. Correct, and I think absolutely right. And it's funny that the expert review on the law actually said not to ban but to do education. And what have they done? The exact opposite of what they said, which makes me think it's obviously a pre-election move, which will end really badly and have some negative consequences, as you said before. Cool. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. We are over time now, but we've loved the conversation. So thanks, Julia, for joining this post-election special podcast. It's been wonderful to chat, and we'll have to get you back in a future episode.
Sounds good. Thanks, James. Thanks, Hugh. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.